allelic variations that predispose to depression, anxiety disorders, various nasty forms of consciousness that are endemic today. I mean, you only have to ask yourself, if you were a prospective parent and you were choosing the genetic makeup of your future child, where on the hedonic scale would you choose the average set point of your future child? Very few parents are going to want depressive children. You might not want to have naturally super happy children, but on the whole, most parents will want to have children who are predisposed to be happy, not malaise-ridden. Now, it's true that although many parents say that all they care about is the happiness of their children, many parents are in fact extremely ambitious for their children, but essentially losers aren't depressive. No parent is really going to want to have depressive children. So over time there's going to be selection pressure against many of our nastier genes. Now, you might say, well, all very well, but surely we're going to carry on having babies by the normal route, this cruel Russian genetic roulette. Some people get dealt a good hand, some get dealt a bad hand. But eventually, I think it's highly likely that almost all reproduction is going to be done by designer babies, and that is because, as the previous speaker has so eloquently outlined, we are going to be phasing out the aging process. One can be arguing over dates, but even on a relatively pessimistic assessment, sometime perhaps next century, when more and more people are becoming quasi-immortal, it is simply not going to be possible to have unlimited reproductive choice. Now, anyone who cares about libertarian freedom and values is going to be extremely queasy about the idea of state licenses or anything like that before having children, but the Earth is effectively going to be reaching its carrying capacity before long unless one actually controls reproduction. And yes, in theory, we can go to the stars, but imagine telling someone that if they want to have a baby, they're going to have to go to Alpha Centauri or something. Yes, perhaps you could tell them, well, you can be uploaded if you want, but I don't know how well that's going to go down. Anyway, I'm skipping a lot of technical arguments here, but I would argue that reproduction in the current sense is going to be phased out. Now, you might say, well, this is an incredible untested experiment, and yes, this is absolutely true. But any form of sexual reproduction is an experiment, completely untested sexual reproduction, and sometimes it has, by today's standards, relatively happy results, sometimes less happy. Not more to be said there on humans, but I'm now going to pass on to the plight of non-human animals, starting off with the so-called meat industry. Each year, tens of billions of non-human animals are slaughtered for food. Most of them are factory farms, and suffer quite appallingly confined conditions. A pig, for instance, is intellectually equivalent to perhaps a 2 or a 3-year-old child, but more to the point, a pig can suffer as much as a 2 or a 3-year-old child. And if one is concerned to fight any form of prejudice or anthropocentric bias, I think it's necessary to recognise that factory farming should be phased out. Now, you sometimes get the argument that these non-human animals wouldn't exist if it weren't for us. I should be grateful. Pretty sorry stuff. I tend to think these arguments, very similar things were said about slavery, that slaves breed for slaves, that the slaves were dependent on us and they should therefore be grateful. I don't think it's actually tenable. However, I'm not going to give you an animal rights rant, because what I'm actually going to talk about is in vitro meat. And if you're as pessimistic as I naturally am about most areas of life, you'll think that as long as most people enjoy the taste of meat, we're going to need to find some cruelty-free way of delivering it. That I very much hope that if you share the transhumanist commitment to the well-being of all sentience, you'll lead a cruelty-free vegan lifestyle. But I think we have to explore technological solutions to the problem. This is the difference between moralizing and ethics and hard-headed technical solutions. In vitro meat, even 5 to 10 years ago, was complete sci-fi, but very rapid progress is being made. 18 months ago, I went to the first in vitro meat conference in Oslo. I expect some of you know about New Harvest promoting meat substitutes. It's probably going to be about 20 or 30 years, perhaps, being pessimistic, before we can produce gourmet cultured meat steaks, but we can already produce crude mincemeat-like consistency. And I think this is going to be the route to global veganism, a combination of advocacy of a cruelty-free vegan lifestyle and highlighting the horrors of the meat industry, combined with a degree of realism and pressing ahead with alternatives. Now, even if we have a human population that is eventually suffering is phased out, even if we have a cruelty-free diet thanks to in vitro meat, there are still immense suffering in the world. One example, for instance, I mentioned domestic cats. How on earth do you cope with 500 million domestic cats, all of whom are obligate carnivores? Well, I know a few animal activists who try to have vegan cats. It's very difficult. But I mean, if and it's a big if, we were morally serious, for instance, we could use catnip-flavoured, mass-produced cultured mincemeat, and within a decade one could get the entire domestic cat population hooked on a cruelty-free substitute. Now, yes, that does sound rather fanciful, but I promise the real objection, the real difficulties are...
David, I have to ask you to wind up.
Okay, how long? 1 minute?
If you could do it in 1 minute, it'd be great.
1 minute. Okay. Finally, in terms of the animal kingdom, if we are serious about getting rid of suffering in the living world, we need to systematically redesign the global ecosystem. This is going to involve immunocontraception, reprogramming predators, neurochips, scanning and very intensive form of surveillance. Essentially, habitat destruction means that within the next 50 years, large mammals won't exist outside our wildlife parks, and the question is what kinds of consciousness and what kinds of creatures we want to exist in our wildlife parks. Predators, eating other animals alive, and it's pretty nasty, being eaten alive or disemboweled, or a kind and compassionate ecosystem. I hope later we're going to be able to talk about these issues more. As I said, there are resources online if you go to abolitionist.com, for instance. And sorry, what's the time?
We're pretty much out for now, so
okay.
Sum up. Okay, thank you very much indeed, David Pearce.
Okay, thank you.